What is up, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Guys, we back with some Formula One. We got the spectacular evolution of F1 pit stops. Man, this is insane because I promise you, I've been checking out some Formula One content, and dude, it looked like it might have been Max Verstappen, Team Red Bull, which we see right. They changed this, man, all 4 tires in like 3 seconds. Kid you not. So we finna see. I know it ain't gonna explain to us how and why it goes so fast, but I just think that's insane, man, because it take me a while to change my own tire. Y'all hit that subscribe button, send down those recommendations.
F1 pit stops haven't always been the 2-second synchronized dances we see today. In the past, they were much more dangerous. From the utter chaos of the first stops, to no pit lane speed limits, to spectacular fuel fires.
Oh my gosh.
Join me as we take a look at the incredible evolution of the F1 pit stop.
What the heck?
Motorsport began pretty much as soon as cars were invented. It all started in France, back in the late 1890s. These pioneers competed on dusty and unmade roads in what we would see today as rallies. But the first Grand Prix races took place a few years later close to Le Mans, around a 65-mile-long closed road track. The two-man car crew did everything: the driving, navigating and repairs. They would have scheduled stops of fuel, but other than that, the only time they would stop would be if they had a mechanical issue or a puncture, which, due to the terrible road surface, was pretty common.
How did they get this?
And it was here that the importance of pit stops was demonstrated from the very first race. A Renault running on Michelin tyres won the race. It was attributed in no small way to Michelin, who had developed a removable rim which allowed...
Hey, I definitely have those Michelins. They are good tires, I ain't gonna lie.
It was attributed in no small way to Michelin, who had developed a removable rim which allowed the crew to simply swap the rim and tyre together instead of levering the inner tube out of the tyre and back in again, as you would on a push bike today. It saved a lot of time. In the 1920s and 30s, the format of races changed and the race cars became more reliable. This meant that a ride-along mechanic was no longer needed. Also, the cars were more streamlined and built for out-and-out speed, so there was no space for a passenger seat anyway.
That's crazy. It's crazy just looking how far we came, how far technology and mechanics, all this stuff came. Cause man, I ain't gonna lie, these cars don't look like they can get up to 100. They may. If y'all know more, I'm sure some of y'all know more history than me when it comes to F1 and you know where it all started and stuff. But these cars don't even look like they pushing 100, and now these cars out here pushing like 300-400. It's crazy.
Races were now run over a number of laps on closed roads, which meant they were able to service the cars at a fixed point, most commonly on the start-finish straight. The surfaces of the circuits were better, but punctures still meant that sometimes they had to swap wheels. Now, at the time, wheels were held in place by a single wing nut. The quickest way to loosen and tighten this was with a large hammer. The races were long and the drivers were not finely honed athletes, as they are today. Refreshments often consisted of chilled champagne, which some drivers favoured to keep them sharp. Into the late 1930s...
They really could have had a quick lunch with how long this taking.
...in the years of the big auto unions and Mercedes factory efforts, and the cars were purpose-built racing machines at the very tip of engineering.
Okay, they may be pushing 100
the pit stops still left a lot to be desired. With the term health and safety having not been invented yet, they would pour gallons of fuel from open containers into poorly fitting funnels. Despite drivers not wearing belts, they didn't consider it worth getting out for this operation, instead favouring a towel over the shoulders to catch any of the spills. Tyres should have been able to last the full length of the race, but as the surfaces were still pretty poor, they sometimes tore themselves to shreds. Now, we take them for granted, but during this period, pit lanes were not a thing. There was no wall separating the track from where the cars would stop. Instead, they would simply pull over on the start-finish straight next to their garage, and the mechanics would get to work. All of this while the race continued and cars screamed past literally a metre behind them. It wasn't until the 1950s that pit lanes started to be introduced on some tracks. It now seems crazy that there was no separation between the cars and the pits, but then again, pouring neat methanol from a milk churn seemed like a great idea at the time too. It wasn't until 1957 that one race would hint at what the future of pit stops could hold. From simply being about essential service and repair to being used as a tactical advantage. By now, Grand Prix cars were finely honed racing machines. Engines could be pushed hard for the duration of the race, and tyre technology had come on so far, one set could confidently last the full race distance. The engineers got around the fuel consumption issues by building larger and larger tanks into the cars. This, of course, made the cars extremely heavy at the start of the race and a lot harder to drive.
Dang.
Then, at the German GP in 1957, Fangio decided to start his Ferrari on the softer compound of tyre, and with his tanks half full, knowing he would have to make a pit stop to change tyres and refuel. His plan worked brilliantly, stretching out a 30-second lead around the tortuous turns of the Nordschleife at the halfway mark.
Hey, he able to get out and everything.
Was a complete disaster, with one of the mechanics dropping a wheel nut under the car and costing over 30 seconds. Fangio then produced one of his most famous drives, coming back from 40 seconds down to win.
Wow.
But thanks to the wheel nut incident, the strategy was seen as too risky to try again, and the pit stop remained for emergencies only for the years to come. Into the 1960s, cars were designed to run the full race distance and finish on the tyres they started with. At the time, there was no such thing as a slick tyre. Rubber compounds available were just not up to the demands required.
Oh my God.
So teams ran the same groove tyre in the wet or the dry. It was only at the end of the 1960s when slick tyres were started.
Yeah, I definitely, especially if I was a driver, definitely would appreciate. That's why it is important. Like, we see how sports and entertainment, how everything has evolved. So I try not to argue with people and try to, because some people will say, oh, back then this was better, or some people will say, oh, today better than what it used to be. But really, I'm that type of person. I appreciate that what was done to lead us to this point. Like, you got to really appreciate the different times, because there's going to be even better stuff that's going to come along later. Like, something even better, someone even better is going to come along later. Like,
become common.
And that's okay.
Clearly, that meant that a wet tyre had to be used when it rained, but it was only when the conditions changed that they needed to swap tyres. At this point, a stop could still take over a minute to complete.
Wow.
The 70s were an iconic time in F1, with radical designs and speeds increasing dramatically. But in reality, the teams are still pretty small, with maybe 10 people running 2 Formula 1 cars, which is unimaginable when compared to today's teams of hundreds. So, when it rained and they had to change from slicks to wets, there weren't many hands on deck to get the job done efficiently. With a fairly clean stop costing around 40 seconds, the pits were still very much a thing to be avoided at all costs. The biggest development of this era was the introduction of the wheel gun, replacing the antiquated hand-operated wrench. A wheel gun is a pneumatic tool that can whip a wheel nut off in less than a second, but, if not used correctly, can break a wrist.
Oh.
However, pit stops were still not well organised, and in the crowded pit lane, chaos often reigned, with a number of enthusiastic team members all waving frantically to guide their driver into the box. The box, by the way, is the term used internationally to describe the area where the car parks outside the front of the pit garage. But in 1982, the legendary car designer Gordon Murray drew upon inspiration from Fangio, realising that although there was no one currently refuelling mid-race, it still was legal to do so. From the British GP onwards, he gambled to start the Brabham BT50s of Nelson Piquet and Riccardo Patrese with low tanks, then refuel and change tyres halfway through the race. They had to develop new fuel rigs, as the existing gravity-fed rigs used in sports cars just weren't fast enough for what they wanted. So they pressurised the system, forcing the exotic fuel mix into the car. Most of their mechanics did have fireproof overalls on, with balaclavas, but some only wore them to cover their hair. Innovatively, and slightly conversely to the lightweight theory of car design, it was probably the first and only Formula 1 car to feature integrated air jacks. Thanks to a few incidents, it took until the Austrian GP for the cars to get to the halfway point in a race and the pit stop. But it worked. Nelson Piquet led from the race start, pitted to take on fuel and tyres, which took just over 25 seconds to complete, and then exited the pits in the lead again, only to be taken out of the race by a backmarker a few laps later.
Dang,
but the game was changed, and most of the other teams designed cars for the following season with refuelling systems in place. This new addition to the pit stops was somewhat unregulated, and teams were pretty much free to do as they wanted. But when you're trying to force as much highly volatile fuel into a red-hot racing car as quickly as possible, it's not surprising it didn't always go to plan. And so the practice of refuelling was banned at the end of the season.
Dang.
However, it was this era that would demonstrate the key role pit stops would play in the outcome of races. There were multiple tyre manufacturers in F1 at the time. Michelin, Goodyear and Pirelli were all fighting it out for supremacy, creating a tyre war. Each manufacturer battled hard to give their chosen teams the best tyre possible, trying to perfect the balance between grip and endurance. The pit stop became critical when tyre compounds became soft. A soft tyre produces a quick lap time, but they could not last the whole race, so strategy became a key feature of Grand Prix racing. Some teams would gamble on pushing as fast as possible, knowing they would need a lightning quick pit stop to change the rubber and get back out on track to push hard again. Whereas others would try and run the whole race on one set, turning slower lap times, but hoping they would save time by not stopping.
Dang.
Probably the most memorable demonstration of this was in 1986. At the Australian GP on the streets of Adelaide, Nigel Mansell just needed to finish third to claim his first World Championship. The Williams team planned to run both cars to the end of the race on one set of rubber. But tyre degradation on the road course was much worse than anticipated. And with 19 laps to go, a spectacular blowout on the back straight damaged the car and put him out of the race and crushed his title hopes.
Dang, that's the worst nightmare right there.
It was much worse than anticipated. And with 19 laps to go, a spectacular blowout on the back straight damaged the car, put him out of the race and crushed his title.
Good thing he's controlling that thing.
It took another 7 years for Mansell to win the world title. By now, teams were more professional and pit stops were an area that they knew was as important as car setup. When you consider a team will invest huge resources designing a car to find tenths of seconds over a lap, a good or bad stop could gain or lose you so much more. During the late 80s and early 90s, as far as technical elements of the pit stop go, nothing much changed. Times were honed down to around 5 seconds for a good clean swap of all 4 tyres, so it became much less likely for a team to try not to stop at all. One of the most startling things to look back on was the fact that there were absolutely no speed limits in the pit lane. Cars could blast down the full length of the pit lane as fast as possible, try to make it into their pit box through the crowds of mechanics from other teams, and then scream back out again, losing as little time as they could.
My God.
The thought of that in these days of health and safety is unimaginable. But, surprisingly, there are only a handful of incidents.
They flying through that pit stop.
The one incident that did change things, however, was at the Imola Grand Prix, on that fateful weekend in 1994. The Minardi of Michele Alboreto lost a wheel just before the pit exit, and struck 4 Ferrari mechanics waiting in their pit box. After the race, the number of team personnel allowed in the pit lane was limited, and a maximum speed of 100 km an hour was introduced, and has stayed ever since. 1994 also saw the reintroduction of refuelling. Things had moved on a lot since it was banned 10 years prior. Each team had to use a mandatory fuel rig supplied by the sport's governing body, and the rate at which the fuel was pumped into the car was controlled at a much slower rate. That was until Benetton, while trying to gain an advantage by increasing the fuel flow, illegally altered their rig, which led to Jos Verstappen's spectacular
gosh. I had to put my head down. That thing. Once I seen the flames, that covered the whole car.
In the fuel flow, illegally altered their rig, which led to Jos Verstappen's spectacular incident at the German GP in Hockenheim. In the race to be stationary for the shortest possible time, cars were sometimes sent before the fuel hose had even been disconnected from the car, with obvious consequences.
What the heck?
Despite a number of incidents, it wasn't until 2010 that in-race refuelling was banned once again. From 1994 to 2009, the pit stop was generally defined by the length of time it took to refuel the car. Unless there was a problem with a wheel gun or a loose nut, the tyres would be changed way before the fuel was finished. This all changed in 2010, when it was now a race between the mechanics of the team as much as the drivers. Rules were introduced which forced the teams to use at least 2 compounds of rubber. This played on the fact that pit stops create many exciting variables, and strategy became a huge element of the races. The pit stop has become a lightning-fast choreographed dance of over 20 people, dressed head to toe in safety kit, all in perfect symmetry, changing 4 wheels in under 2 seconds. For an in-depth look at a modern Formula 1 pit stop, head over to the video we made earlier to understand the fine details of this impressive system. The pit crew is now an integral part of the team, and is prepared with as much precision as any other part of the car. Although all pit crew double up in other roles within the team, a huge part of their job is spent training, analysing and perfecting their individual role in the stop.
Definitely made it simpler.
Pride in their work, and you can see that when they know they've had a good stop. Conversely, it's clear when it did not go well. The harsh reality of a pit stop is that the pit crew can rarely win a race, but they can very easily lose one. So, as you can see, pit stops have come from necessity and to be avoided at all possible costs, to being transformed into pivotal elements of an F1 race, which have been added into the mix to create a bigger show. Love them or hate them, they're here to stay, and they prove that it's more than just the driver in the car that wins the race.
They are a key element for sure. I gotta subscribe, Driver61. Man, it's crazy. They went from what, 30 seconds to almost a minute to 2 seconds. I ain't gonna lie, the fueling system, that's scary right there. That is scary. That was like, I had to put my head down on that whole car. I hope he was able to get out of there. I mean, that was wild. He just missing it. That's crazy. That remind me almost of the Grosjean. Once he hit, that thing just went up into flames. That's a crazy thing. That's a crazy thing. But man, like I said, you just gotta appreciate the times that, you know, it ain't nothing to just hate on or like, you know, brag on, but appreciate that there's people out there that found new ways, new systems to make it easier for us. I appreciate you guys, you know, and I'm not even an F1 driver, you know, but I appreciate people that been there, done that, and was able to be a part of making new systems and stuff. You know, you gotta appreciate that stuff. But that's all I have for this video. Y'all hit that subscribe button, send out those recommendations, and be blessed, be the best, and be you. I'm out.